moment is fundamental and applicable not only to all of the projects currently running in our community-sponsored project course, but really anytime you're building an application for most kind of clients. Basically, we're focusing here on internal use applications, something that you're building for the use of the employees at a company, or it could be a volunteer organization, could be a church group, a sports league, whatever. But the idea is it's not so much a public-facing one for any Joe Blow to come along and register on. It's more for internal use by the people involved in the organization or company, right? So to get that up and working, well, we're going to build on some of what we did last term. Last term, we started off getting familiar with the identity system itself. And the identity system, as we saw, was very powerful, allowed us to do authentication, authenticate the users logging in, and then authorizing them to carry out certain kinds of tasks within the system, right? So that identity user that we started off with, main key properties we've used so far, things like the email, or so you could switch it to use username, but the point is there'd be a unique identifier. I'm just going to stick with email for now. And then a password. But of course, if you look in the identity user class, there's other properties there. There's even a phone number, although to be honest with you, that's mainly there for two-factor authentication, right? But there's things like lockouts and so on and so forth. But there's not a huge number of properties, and you're not encouraged to go in and start messing with the identity user class itself per se, right? So that's a bit of an issue. What if we want to track additional information about the users in our internal system itself, right? Well, what you can do, the system was designed from the beginning to be highly customizable, but the approach that is encouraged is you would actually create your own application user, for example. That's a common name used in many tutorials, class that inherits from identity user, right? So you get all the good unique identifier, the email, the password, and so on from identity user, but you can add as many properties as you need, right? So it could be things like, tracking emergency contact information for the user. Or it could be work-related things like noting what level of first aid training, if that's applicable to the company itself, what first aid training level they've achieved, or are they certified to be able to manage groups of 10 or more, whatever's applicable to the actual company, right? So just a bit of a warning, though, just because you can throw additional properties in here does not mean that you're done, right? You're still going to do an awful lot of work. It's not like you're going to say, oh, I'll throw a property here and has it scaffold all the inputs. No, you're going to have to manually go into all the pages, add input controls, do the code to, include them in white lists and so on and so forth, and make sure all of it's maintained properly. So, it's not quite as easy as you might think at first to just throw additional properties in here, but it can be done, right? That being said, I'm not going to encourage you to follow this approach. I'm going to encourage you to consider having a separate model instead, right? Why? Well, having a separate model class to track that dedicated information about your, here I find myself saying staff, volunteer, employee, all these different terms that it might be. So, to try and cut down on my rambling, I'll maybe stick more or less most of the time to the term employee, because that's what I'm using in my actual demo code, right? So we can have additional properties related, to about our employee in a separate model. And because it's going to be in our own production database, we can actually have it relate directly with foreign keys, referential integrity, and so on, with navigation properties and so on, through all of our other entities in our production tables, and it doesn't have to involve the identity system, right? And what that does is it leaves, among other things, the option to keep identity in a separate database. We did talk about that last term, that in some situations, what you might do is have a common login system where all the identity data is in its own database, and that is shared among multiple applications, right? You can have a common login and use it in multiple apps. That way you're only maintaining that password information and everything else in one location. It leaves the door open to do that. There's other reasons why a separate model is the way to go, right? audit data, historical information. Now, it could just be basic auditing, or it could be, as we'll do a learning moment later on extensive auditing, tracking every change made by every user, right, in the system. That might be important in some applications. Well, if all that audit data, all that historic information relates back to the identity user, okay, then unfortunately the identity user record doesn't have a simple on-off switch, right? We can't just say, oh, that one's disabled, okay? There's no property for that. Yeah, you can mess around, play with things like lockouts and so on and so forth, but it's not quite as simple as you might think it would be to do that. So this is a great arrangement, having a separate model, because we can have all the historic information, the audit information, etc., related to the actual employee model. And that way, if we need to delete the identity user record, no big deal. If they ever come back again, we can actually just recreate, log in for them, and relate it back to the historic information stored based on their employee class, right? Okay, just remember that to be able to relate the two systems to each other, they have to have something in common. They both must have a unique required property, okay, that is common to both. And that's where we usually use the email address, because it works out as something that is almost always unique and required in both systems, right? So here's what we end with. So on the right hand of the screen here, you'll see basically the identity system. We have our application DB contacts and the identity user, okay, with that unique identifier, usually the email and a password and whatever, right? On the left, here's our own DB contacts, our production tables. So we might have a table called employee. Again, could be any kind of a user, worker, volunteer, whatever, right? Staff member, but I'll just go with the term employee. So that as well has that unique, okay, required information in common, the email address, right? And they relate to each other on that commonality, okay? And then we can have as many properties as we want right in the employee table. And the advantage as well is, okay, since it's in the DB context, it can have all the referential integrity relationships in place to relate to other information in the system, store anything we want in here to do with, well, as I said earlier, emergency contact data, whatever else, right? Qualification levels and things like that, all this custom information about the employee that we need to track, and all the historical information about what they're responsible for doing inside the system and so on, right? Okay, so this is a great approach. The matching records is required, that commonality of a unique required piece of information, but we can easily provide that, right? Okay, now if you want to look in the details of the PowerPoint, I have it posted. I do talk about method 1 and method 2. So basically, in a nutshell, method 1, the admin, these are all for internal use, remember, right? So the admin would create the identity record, and then as the user logs in, then they're prompted to complete their own profile information that would generate, or they would be responsible essentially for creating the employee record as they do so, right? That would be method 1. Method 2, the user creates the employee record, the admin creates the employee record. We do allow a register link, but then we do a check. No one can actually successfully register unless they already have an existing employee record created by the administrator. Anyway, I talk about the pluses and minuses of those two approaches, but really what it comes down to is the most comprehensive is this one here I'm going to encourage you to follow, and this is what we'll demonstrate as well, right? Just that I've had clients ask for some of the other methods. That's why I included them here in the notes. But really, this is the one. It takes care of everything. It's a combination of the first two. And really, in my opinion, it's the best single method, right? So our assumptions, again, it's internal use. Anonymous users should not be able to register in the app. So we don't need a register link even available, okay? Now, we do want the user to be able to go in and maintain some of the properties, at least in the user class. Like, again, we mentioned emergency contact. Why would I want to burden the admin with having to go in and update that the emergency contact information has changed, right? No. So we'll let the user have access to many of the properties, right, so they can look after keeping that up to date themselves. But of course, there'll be some properties of a user or employee, if you prefer, that only the admin should be able to change, like, certifications, whether they're authorized to perform different kinds of work, etc., right? Even I mentioned before, the level of training in different areas, maybe it's first aid and things like that, right? The user shouldn't be able to go in and change that themselves, right? Somebody else would be responsible for doing that. But the admin also wants to be able to assign them to specific roles, right, in terms of the authorization, right, within the system as well, okay? And that can be their job in addition, right? So the approach here will have the admin create the employee, or if you prefer, user record, the one in our own production table, setting any restricted properties and so on, specifying role assignments that should be there in the identity system as well as they do so. And we will automatically create that identity user record in the identity system in parallel at the same time. And we can assign them to the roles that were requested by the admin as the admin creates the actual employee record, right? Optionally, of course, we can do things like send out an email to the new user inviting them to come and use forgot password to create their own password, right? And once they log into the app, we can, if they don't have all their profile information complete, we can keep nagging them to every time they log in, oh, you have to finish your profile, right? And then they can go in and fill in all the missing details there as well. That's another option we can implement with this approach. And of course, the admin, in this case, will also have the ability to go in and make a user inactive, right? And what we would do then is we would delete the identity user record, right? That way they can no longer log into the system, but everything about the user, other than their login, is preserved in the actual employee or user table in the production system itself, right? And all the audit history is still available and everything else, right? So that's going to be the approach that we're going to actually go forward and implement here. It's a fair bit of code to get in place, but we'll walk through it slowly and make sure that you understand what we're doing as we carry out the process of implementing this method, right? As I say, it's essentially a combination of the first two ones. For details of those, feel free to just look at all the slides in this PowerPoint itself, right? So why is this one the way to go? Well, the admin can set everything they want right away. They don't need to wait for the user at all, right? And they can leave unrestricted properties, ones that the user can fill in themselves. For them to get that done, they'll be nagged until they get it completed if you set it up that way in the system yourself, right? The only real disadvantage is this is the one that's the most work to get set up, right? But it's actually really worth it, right? Especially if you need to set restricted properties. In other words, there are certain things that only admin or somebody like that should be able to set about a given employee or user and assign them to roles and so on as well, right? Just a couple final thoughts before we leave off and get into the demo. So far, we've been talking strictly about internal use applications only, right? But in the real world, you may want to allow anonymous users to register in an app, okay? And none of these methods are really set up for that, right? So for public-facing or informational apps where a registered user has access to, some information, maybe blogs and so on, right? Then you want to take a slightly different approach, okay? So you would have them able to log in, and what you could do is have some areas in the website hidden, right, until they're given certain role assignments and so on. And that could be role assignments within the identity system or within your own production tables as well, okay? So by registering, they'll get an identity user record, right? And optionally, an admin may go in and decide, well, we're going to elevate this user, give them a specific role within the functioning of the company by creating an additional record in our own production tables, like an employee type record or volunteer record, right? So yeah, you can take this approach and vary it for different situations, but the essential steps that we're about to go through could be commonly used in both situations. Okay, well, let's get into the actual demo itself.